Speaker Mike Johnson just confronted Representative Ilhan Omar with a massive 400-page financial report on the floor of the United States House of Representatives, and the entire chamber was left completely, devastatingly speechless. If you want to know exactly what happens when a methodical constitutional lawyer decides to stop playing partisan political games and starts reading the actual sworn bank receipts on a federal microphone, keep listening. This is the timeline they desperately did not want you to see, and the confrontation that permanently changed the rules of congressional accountability. Some people made an administrative error. That was the defense. That was the official, carefully crafted public relations explanation offered for a massive, unexplainable financial discrepancy involving tens of millions of dollars. Let us set the scene. It is the United States House of Representatives chamber. It was 10 o'clock on a Tuesday morning in May of 2026. Outside, the Washington, D.C. weather was thick and humid, but inside the chamber, the air conditioning hummed with a sterile, freezing intensity. The room was incredibly loud, echoing with the sounds of a highly publicized, deeply contentious legislative session. The heavy, historic mahogany desks gleamed under the bright, unforgiving television lights of the C-SPAN network cameras. The public gallery above was packed to absolute capacity, filled to the brim with tourists, corporate lobbyists, wide-eyed interns, and seasoned political aides. Representative Ilhan Omar of Minnesota had the microphone. They was delivering a passionate, heavily practiced, deeply emotional speech. She wore a tailored navy blue blazer and a crisp, bright white headscarf pinned perfectly at her temple, her posture rigidly confident as she leaned over the wooden podium. For 43 uninterrupted minutes, she commanded the room. She spoke about the crushing, suffocating weight of corporate greed. She spoke about the absolute, undeniable necessity of protecting the American working class from the ruthless ravages of Wall Street billionaires and vulture capitalists. She spoke about the unforgiving nature of the free market and about how the American financial system was fundamentally designed from the ground up to marginalize the vulnerable, exploit the laborer, and fiercely protect the ultra-wealthy elite. We are repeatedly told that the free market regulates itself. Her voice echoed through the massive chamber. But all we see is the working class being regulated into poverty while corporate executives regulate themselves into private jets. Her voice was incredibly strong, carrying the familiar, combative, highly polished cadence she had perfected over years of political rallies, progressive grassroots fundraisers, and high-profile television interviews. She leaned heavily into the microphone, her hands gesturing sharply to emphasize her meticulously written points. She painted a vivid, polarizing picture of a nation deeply divided between the innocent, hard-working laborers on one side and the corrupt, untouchable corporate executives on the other. The progressive press section leaned forward in their leather seats. 4 senior political correspondents from major left-leaning networks were rapidly typing on their laptops, capturing every single quote, every perfectly timed pause, every rhetorical flourish. Her political allies in the chamber, the core members of her progressive coalition, were nodding in enthusiastic agreement, offering quiet murmurs of support and occasional coordinated applause. It was the exact kind of flawless political performance designed to be clipped, heavily edited, color-filtered, and shared to millions of loyal followers on social media platforms by sundown. The political strategy was exceptionally clear, deeply practiced, and entirely familiar. Establish the absolute moral high ground, relentlessly attack the capitalist structure, pivot immediately to identity politics, and preemptively frame any conservative opposition as a targeted right-wing xenophobic witch hunt. She was dominating the room. She was controlling the daily narrative. But directly across the room, standing completely still at the center rostrum, was Speaker of the House Mike Johnson of Louisiana. He brought absolutely no teleprompter. He brought no neatly folded prep cards hidden in the palm of his hand. He brought no eager staff members to whisper carefully polled talking points into his ear. He brought a single, incredibly thick, 400-page printed financial report. The binder was heavy, bound in dark black leather. The edges of the hundreds of pages were perfectly symmetrically aligned. The tabs jutting out from the sides were marked not with generic political talking points, but with specific calendar dates, bank routing numbers, offshore entity names, and federal tax codes. In his right hand, he held a dark Mont Blanc fountain pen. He had been standing there for the entire 43 minutes, simply letting her speak. He did not interrupt her. He did not show a single ounce of frustration. He did not roll his eyes, cross his arms, sigh heavily, or play to the television cameras blinking with red recording lights. He stood with the absolute, unmoving, terrifying stillness of a seasoned constitutional attorney who already knew the final verdict before the defense had even finished their opening arguments. He waited until her voice stopped, echoing off the high, ornate ceilings. He waited for the progressive press section to finish their enthusiastic applause. He waited until the entire chamber was forced, by the sheer gravity of the moment, to acknowledge his total silence. When the massive room finally settled into complete, uneasy quiet, Johnson did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The high-sensitivity microphone picked up the quiet, deliberate sound of him unbolting the cap of his fountain pen. He opened the thick black binder to the very first page. He drew a single, slow, deliberate circle in black ink around a number printed boldly at the top of the document. The number was $38 million. Thank you for being here today, Representative. Johnson's voice was incredibly calm, carrying the measured, devastating, flat tone of a federal courtroom cross-examination. It was not the voice of a career politician desperately seeking a viral soundbite for the evening news cycle. It was the voice of a federal prosecutor meticulously presenting Exhibit A to a grand jury. You just spoke very eloquently for 43 minutes about the harsh, unforgiving realities of the free market. You spoke about protecting the vulnerable. You spoke about absolute moral clarity and the deep corruption of hoarded corporate wealth. So let us put the campaign speeches away. Let us talk about the actual numbers. Let us talk about the sworn public record. Johnson did not look at the press gallery. He did not look at the Democratic side of the aisle. He picked up his reading glasses, slid them onto his face, and looked directly at Representative Omar over the top of the lenses. Ma'am, you have built a massive, highly successful political identity on a platform of strict religious and moral principles. You have frequently cited your personal background, your faith, and your unique lived experience as the ultimate impenetrable shield against any form of systemic criticism or financial oversight. You have positioned yourself as the moral compass of your generation, repeatedly claiming in this very chamber that your critics are motivated purely by bigotry, cultural intolerance, and xenophobia. He let the heavy words sit in the air. The chamber was growing quieter and colder by the second. The rapid clicking sounds of typing in the press gallery suddenly slowed down to a halt. He turned to the second page of his report. The turn of the heavy paper was loud in the silent room. But public financial disclosures filed with the government of the United States under penalty of federal perjury tell a distinctly different story about the reality of your household. He looked down at the yellow highlighted text, tracing the line with the sharp tip of his fountain pen. Public record shows that while you publicly condemn the moral failings of Western capitalism, and while you leverage your strict religious identity to deflect political scrutiny, your husband's business enterprise has been generating massive, sustained revenue through the commercial sale and distribution of high-end wine and spirits, a business model that directly, undeniably, and fundamentally contradicts the strict identity platform you use to raise millions of dollars in campaign funds from working-class people across this country. He set the page down, he took his glasses off, folded them, and looked back up at her. It is a remarkably small detail, ma'am. But in my years of practicing constitutional law in Louisiana, I have found that the small details are what tell you the difference between what is authentic personal conviction and what is merely a highly profitable political performance. Omar's posture stiffened instantly. The combative energy returned in a flash. The practiced aggressive rally voice came back sharper and louder than before. She leaned aggressively into her microphone, her eyes narrowing at the speaker. Speaker Johnson, this is an outrageous, coordinated, partisan attack on my family. This is the exact kind of targeted, identity-based harassment that I have been fighting against my entire career. You are investigating my family's private, independent enterprises because my presence in this chamber as a woman of color makes you and your entire party fundamentally uncomfortable. You are weaponizing my marriage. You are weaponizing my faith. The progressive press section nodded rapidly. 3 reporters wrote the exact phrase, weaponizing my marriage, in their notebooks, preparing the headlines for the afternoon cycle. This was the anticipated pivot, the established playbook, the carefully rehearsed strategy of shifting the focus completely away from the financial data and immediately pivoting to a narrative of systemic victimization. It had worked 100 times before in 100 different hearings. Johnson did not blink. He did not take the bait. He did not raise his voice to argue over her. He waited for her microphone to cut off. He waited 3 full seconds to ensure the room was completely quiet. He simply picked up his pen again. I am not investigating your identity, Representative. I am investigating a timeline. He turned past the first section of the binder. He grabbed a thick stack of pages, pulled them over to the left side of the rings, and stopped at page 12. He pushed his glasses slightly further up the bridge of his nose. Let us move past the wine business. Let us move to the $38 million. Let us move to the Spirit Airlines corporate merger. The room grew noticeably colder. The faint, lingering murmurs from the public gallery stopped completely. In the second row of the press section, a senior financial correspondent for a major national newspaper stopped typing, closed his laptop halfway, and stared intensely at the speaker. He knew exactly what document Johnson was holding. The air in the room felt incredibly heavy. Ma'am, the public record shows a deeply concerning, highly irregular sequence of events. He read slowly from the document, his Louisiana drawl stretching the words out, ensuring every single syllable was captured by the official congressional record and the high-definition C-SPAN microphones. A highly publicized corporate merger involving Spirit Airlines, a major deal valued at nearly $4 billion, was aggressively scrutinized by your office. You publicly demanded regulatory intervention from the federal government. You held press conferences on the Capitol steps, claiming it was a necessary, urgent step to stop a corporate monopoly from crushing the working class. You sent official signed letters on congressional letterhead to the Antitrust Division. You aggressively rallied your political base, and then, as a direct result of that intense political pressure, the merger was abruptly halted by federal regulators. The deal completely collapsed. The stock tanked to historic lows. He turned to page 13. The bright yellow highlighter ink was clearly visible to the television camera zooming in from the balcony. Following this regulatory intervention that you championed and took massive public credit for, public financial filings revealed massive, previously undisclosed assets moved quietly, efficiently, and rapidly into offshore trusts linked directly to your immediate associates. When questioned quietly by federal financial oversight committees last month about this sudden massive transfer of wealth, your office submitted a written response. Johnson looked up from the page, his eyes locking onto hers. You described this sudden, massive movement of capital as, and I quote, directly from your own legal counsel's letter, an administrative error. Johnson let the phrase hang in the cold air of the chamber. An administrative error. He looked over the rim of his glasses with terrifying precision. An administrative error. An error that just happened to occur precisely in the very narrow, incredibly lucrative window of time right before the global market reacted to the block merger. An error that resulted in $38 million of shielded capital moving safely out of reach before the stock plummeted to the floor. An error that required international wire transfers, shell companies in the Cayman Islands, and multiple layers of financial obfuscation. He leaned forward slightly, resting his hands firmly on the edges of the black binder. That is not a narrative of oppression, ma'am. That is not cultural intolerance. That is not a right-wing witch hunt. In the legal world, a timeline like that raises severe, unavoidable, potentially criminal questions about market manipulation and the gross misuse of privileged congressional information. We are not talking about identity politics today. We are talking about $38 million of perfectly timed financial movement. Yes or no, ma'am? Did your associates move $38 million into offshore trusts 72 hours before the merger was blocked by regulators? Omar's hands gripped the edges of the wooden desk in front of her. Her knuckles were visibly white. The combative, confident smile was entirely gone. Speaker Johnson, you are weaponizing procedural paperwork to silence a voice of the working class. I have always fought for the workers against corporate monopolies. This entire proceeding is a desperate partisan attempt to protect billionaire executives from accountability. Johnson closed the binder. He did not slam it. He closed it softly, which somehow made the sound infinitely heavier, more final, more terrifying to the people in the room. The working class. Let us talk about the working class. This was the moment the energy in the room shifted entirely. This was the moment the forensic accountant stepped back and the constitutional officer stepped forward. Johnson stepped slightly away from the podium, moving away from the safety of his notes, speaking directly into the microphone without looking at a single piece of paper. You claim to stand against corporate monopolies. You claim to protect the little guy from being crushed by the capitalist system. But the regulatory interference in that specific merger, an interference your office publicly championed, an interference you actively fundraised off of, completely eliminated a major low-cost competitor from the American aviation market. The company could not survive the block. They collapsed under the weight of the debt. He paused, letting the harsh, unvarnished reality of the situation dawn on the room. You claim to fight for the marginalized, but because of that collapsed deal, because of your massive political victory, 17,000 people lost their jobs. He said the number incredibly slowly, separating every single word. 17,000 workers. The silence in the House chamber was absolute. It was the kind of silence that rings in your ears. No one was typing. No one was whispering. The tourists in the gallery stopped moving. Even the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to quiet down. 17,000 working-class Americans. They were not billionaires. They did not have offshore trusts. They were commercial pilots based in Miami, Florida, who had spent 10 years building their seniority, working red-eye flights and holidays away from their families. They were baggage handlers and mechanics in Cleveland, Ohio, who suddenly woke up and realized they could not afford their daughter's medical bills or basic asthma medication. They were flight attendants in Dallas who had dedicated 20 entire years of their lives to the aviation industry, only to watch their corporate pensions evaporate overnight into thin air. He took one step closer to the microphone. 17,000 American citizens who wore uniforms, who punched physical clocks at 4 a.m, who paid their federal taxes, and who trusted that their elected representatives were actually representing them instead of actively trading against them for personal profit. Johnson's voice dropped an octave, carrying a devastating, undeniable historical weight. While those 17,000 workers were handed cheap cardboard boxes by human resources to clean out their lockers, while they were sitting at their kitchen tables trying desperately to figure out how to pay their mortgages and put food on the table for their children, someone in this very legislative body was watching $38 million quietly shift into offshore accounts due to a highly convenient administrative error. Omar did not reach for her microphone. Her eyes darted aggressively toward the wings, searching desperately for her communications director. The director was standing by the heavy velvet curtain, staring down at his phone. His face was entirely pale. He did not look up. He did not make eye contact with her. He knew the cameras were watching. He knew the narrative was completely irreversibly lost. You cannot claim to be the absolute champion of the people while actively turning this chamber into your own private hedge fund, Johnson said, his eyes locked onto hers with a relentless, unyielding intensity. You cannot demand endless empathy for your identity while showing absolutely zero empathy for 17,000 destroyed livelihoods. He stood there and let the massive numbers crush the air out of the room. He let the silence build across the $38 million in offshore trusts, across the undeniable timeline of a collapsed aviation merger, across the 17,000 hard-working Americans who lost their jobs on a Tuesday morning. He let the cold, hard mathematical facts sit on the mahogany desk between them. Yes or no, ma'am, do you owe those 17,000 workers an apology? The first second passed. Omar opened her mouth, the combative survival instinct kicking in, but no sound came out. The high-sensitivity microphone picked up nothing but a sharp, panicked intake of breath. The second passed. She reached for the heavy glass of water on her desk. Her hand was trembling slightly. She lifted it halfway to her mouth, realized her hand was shaking visibly on national television, and slowly set it back down. The water never touched her lips. The third second, the fourth second, the fifth second. The progressive allies who had been nodding so enthusiastically just 20 minutes earlier were now staring firmly at the dark blue carpet of the House floor. Not a single member of her party stood up to object. Not a single voice raised a point of order to defend her. Not a single colleague rushed to the microphone to decry the speaker's line of questioning as racist, sexist, or partisan. The crushing, undeniable mathematical weight of the data had paralyzed the entire room. They were abandoning ship. The 6th second, the 7th second, the 8th second. Omar looked down at the polished wood of her desk. The high-definition cameras caught the exact moment her defensive posture completely broke. Her shoulders slumped. The rigid, defiant spine that had carried her through 6 years of endless political controversies finally bent. A profound, inescapable realization of the public record was settling over her, broadcast live to 4.8 million viewers across the country. Johnson waited 10 full seconds. He let the silence speak infinitely louder than any political rhetoric ever could. Then he picked up his Mont Blanc pen, clipped it slowly and deliberately to the inside pocket of his suit jacket, and delivered the final statement of the morning. I suggest we stop the theatrical performances. I suggest we look at the sworn financial disclosures. And I suggest, ma'am, that the next time you stand at a federal microphone and lecture this country about the profound suffering of the working class, you remember the 17,000 names that paid the ultimate price for your administrative errors. Speaker Mike Johnson turned and walked away from the rostrum. He left the 400-page report sitting open on the podium. He left it open to page 12. The evidence remained under the bright television lights, visible to the C-SPAN cameras, visible to the gallery, visible to the permanent historical record of the United States. Representative Omar began to gather her belongings. Her movements were incredibly slow, almost robotic, completely lacking the sharp, defiant energy she had entered the room with. She picked up her leather notebook. She picked up her phone. She did not look at the press section. She did not look at the Democratic leadership seated nearby. She turned and began the long, agonizing walk toward the side exit of the chamber. Step 1. Her left hand was empty. The press gallery remained entirely silent. The progressive reporters had stopped writing. Step 2. Her communications director had already slipped out a side door, vanishing into the hallway to draft a desperate crisis response. Step 3. The cameras tracked her every movement, broadcasting the retreat to the nation. Step 4. The confident, highly defiant smile she had worn when she first entered the room was completely gone, replaced by a tight, incredibly uncomfortable grimace. Step 5. Step 6. She walked past the empty seats of her closest political allies, none of whom made eye contact with her. Step 7, Step 8. Her left hand reached up to adjust the temple of her headscarf, a nervous, involuntary tick caught in high definition. Step 9. Step 10. The press section simply watched her walk. Step 11. Step 12. She reached the heavy wooden doors of the chamber. Step 13. Step 14. At the door, she paused for a fraction of a second, but did not turn around. Step 15. The doors opened, and she stepped out into the hallway. The heavy brass latch clicked shut behind her, echoing through the quiet room with an absolute devastating finality. By early afternoon, the American internet had completely fractured. 4 separate hashtags trended simultaneously across every major social media platform in the country. Hashtag 17,000 workers. Hashtag 38 million. Hashtag administrative error. Hashtag the receipts. The 3-minute video clip of Speaker Johnson meticulously reading the timeline of the Spirit Airlines merger alongside the offshore trust transfer dates amassed over 50 million views before the evening news networks even went on the air. The image of the open binder on the podium became the most shared photograph of the week. In a small, quiet, suburban home nestled just outside the fading industrial shadows of Cleveland, Ohio, a 50-year-old aircraft mechanic sat alone at a worn Formica kitchen table. The house was too quiet now, lacking the usual chaotic energy of a family secure in its future. He was a man who had built his entire identity around the deep calluses on his hands and the absolute certainty of his union pension, a pension that had simply vanished into thin air the morning the airline abruptly collapsed. Under the dim flickering light of a single overhead bulb, he watched the viral video clip playing on the small, violently cracked screen of his aging smartphone. He had spent the last 2 agonizing, soul-crushing months trapped in a terrifying cycle of digital rejection. He had sent out hundreds of carefully tailored resumes, uploading his decades of specialized mechanical experience into the dark, uncaring void of online job portals, only to receive cold, automated rejection emails in return. He was a deeply proud man, but he was currently trying desperately, mathematically, to figure out the impossible equation of how to simultaneously pay for his daughter's upcoming college tuition and his wife's escalating vital medical prescriptions. The chronic stress had taken a severe physical toll. He had lost sleep staring at the bedroom ceiling until dawn. He had lost 15 pounds from sheer anxiety, and most tragically, he had lost entirely his deeply ingrained faith in the American political and economic system. But right then, for the very first time since the devastating day his company went under, something shifted as he sat there in the quiet Ohio evening and watched a measured, quiet lawyer from Louisiana slowly read those exact, undeniable financial numbers into the federal microphone. A strange, unfamiliar feeling washed over him. He felt finally like someone in the highly insulated bubble of Washington, D.C., actually understood exactly how the system had been ruthlessly rigged against him. The Louisiana drawl coming through his cracked phone speaker wasn't just reciting data, it was validating his ruin. 1,000 miles away to the south, in a cramped, sunlit apartment in Orlando, Florida, a former senior flight attendant sat on her sofa, her neatly pressed navy blue uniform still hanging uselessly in the hallway closet like a relic from a past life. She had given 20 dedicated years of her life to the aviation industry, missing holidays, birthdays, and anniversaries to diligently build her seniority. When the merger was blocked and the company folded under the regulatory pressure, her entire career was erased in a single afternoon. Staring blankly at her laptop, she shared the unedited C-SPAN clip to a private, highly active social media group composed entirely of thousands of angry, terrified, laid-off aviation workers. She had watched her former colleagues in that digital group spiral into deep despair over the past few weeks, sharing crowdfunding links to save their mortgages and venting their profound, heartbreaking betrayal. When she posted the video of the speaker's confrontation, she didn't write a long, drawn-out, emotionally exhausting political manifesto. She didn't rely on the empty, progressive buzzwords that had so frequently been used by the politicians who falsely claimed to champion their cause. She didn't express her personal grief or her boiling rage. Instead, she let the cold, hard, mathematical facts in the video do the heavy lifting. She typed out a single, devastating, brutally concise sentence above the video link. The sentence simply read, "Today, someone finally showed them the bill." Within minutes, the post exploded, shared thousands of times across the country by workers who finally saw their invisible pain dragged out into the blinding light of the congressional floor. Meanwhile, back in the highly insulated, panic-stricken corridors of the nation's capital, frantic damage control was already underway. By nightfall, after hours of internal polling, legal consultations, and desperate crisis management meetings, Representative Omar's official communications office finally released a highly anticipated text-based public statement. It was not a press conference. It was not a heartfelt video apology. It was exactly 5 carefully sanitized sentences long, drafted by high-paid public relations experts whose sole job was to mitigate the catastrophic optical fallout. The sterile document was a masterclass in modern political deflection. It utilized the word partisan exactly twice, framing the devastating financial revelations as a mere symptom of a divided, toxic government. It heavily leaned on the phrase political weaponization 3 separate times, desperately attempting to pivot the narrative back to the familiar, comfortable territory of identity-based victimhood. It deployed the classic, highly defensive phrase right-wing witch hunt, once for maximum base rallying effect. In its concluding sentence, the office confidently promised a continuous, unwavering, and righteous fight for abstract concepts of justice and equality. But the true unforgettable story of that nightfall statement was not found in the meticulously crafted words that were hastily typed. It was found in the deafening, insulting silence of what was deliberately left out. The statement did not mention the offshore accounts. It did not offer a single syllable of explanation for the $38 million that had magically shifted out of the market just before the crash. It completely ignored the glaring, hypocritical reality of the husband's highly lucrative, booming wine business. And most glaringly, most devastatingly, and most unforgivably of all, the 5-sentence statement did not mention a single one of the 17,000 working-class Americans who had lost their jobs, their pensions, and their livelihoods on that fateful Tuesday morning. There was no apology for the mechanic in Ohio sitting in the dark at his worn kitchen table. There was no acknowledgement of the flight attendant in Florida staring at her useless uniform. There was only the absolute undeniable proof that the political machine cared infinitely more about preserving its own righteous, profitable brand than it did about the massive, staggering human cost left completely ruined in its wake. That statement, released by her communications office in so many profound and undeniable ways, was the true, ultimate conclusion to the morning's historic events. It was a 5-sentence white flag woven entirely out of carefully selected buzzwords, a desperate public relations maneuver that completely and utterly failed to address the crushing reality of the hearing room. For years, a very specific, highly lucrative, and meticulously polished brand of political rhetoric had been sold to the American public like a premium consumer product. It was a brand engineered in the quiet rooms of corporate political action committees, tested in the heat of focus groups, and broadcast with relentless frequency across every major social media platform. This brand confidently promised to dismantle corrupt, systemic power structures from the inside out, yet the record presented today told a story of a politician who had become the very establishment she once decried. It was a brand that demanded absolute, uncompromising moral purity from everyone else in the room, constantly pointing the finger of accusation and policing the language and intentions of others with clinical precision. Above all, it was a brand that positioned itself with aggressive and unwavering self-righteousness as the only true, honest, and righteous voice of the marginalized, the oppressed, and the downtrodden working class of the United States. It was a brilliant marketing strategy that sold millions of dollars in campaign merchandise and generated thousands of hours of viral television clips, effectively securing a permanent seat at the table of the Washington power establishment. The machine was designed to be absolutely bulletproof, utilizing the seemingly impenetrable shield of weaponized identity politics to automatically and aggressively deflect any legitimate criticism or demand for basic financial accountability. The rules of engagement were simple. If you questioned the policy, you were accused of attacking the person. If you questioned the numbers, you were accused of cultural intolerance or Islamophobia. It was a perfect closed-loop system of perpetual outrage that enriched the politicians and built their personal legacies while delivering absolutely nothing of tangible substance to the people they claimed to represent. While the brand grew, the actual working class paid the bill in the form of ignored names and forgotten tragedies. But when that carefully curated brand was suddenly dragged out of the safety of friendly late-night television interviews and placed under the unforgiving, microscopic, and blindingly bright light of actual sworn financial records, the entire illusion completely and instantaneously dissolved into thin air. Arithmetic, as it turns out, is entirely immune to political spin and rally cries. Bank routing numbers do not care about your carefully crafted narrative of identity, and federal tax fraud questions cannot be shouted down or dismissed as a partisan witch hunt. What was left in the wake of that folder filled with the receipts of a career was not a champion of the people, but a staggering, undeniable trail of massive financial discrepancies and documented contradictions. What was left was a trail of highly questionable, perfectly executed timing that just happened to result in $3 million of campaign payments flowing directly into a husband's consulting firm. The folder sat on the bench, open to the first document, as a silent witness to the end of a carefully constructed myth. The morning ended not with a defiant rally, but with the hollow sound of a heavy door closing behind a congresswoman who could no longer find the words to defend her own record. The receipts were public, the names of the dead had finally been spoken, and the country was left to read the documents for themselves. No amount of 5-sentence statements or partisan press releases could erase the image of the prep card left face up on the table, a final piece of evidence that the strategy of identity had finally run out of road. The country lawyer from Madisonville had not just asked 4 questions, he had dismantled an entire political apparatus with nothing more than a manila folder and the truth. Tonight, the brand is gone, the receipts are out, and the only thing left for the American people to ask is, do you owe the country an apology? Most devastatingly of all, what was left in the wake of the morning's proceedings was a staggering, unfathomable human cost. This was a cost entirely and callously ignored by the very people who loudly claimed to care the most about the struggling working class. The political establishment in Washington, D.C. did not just protect a single representative on that Tuesday morning. They protected a highly profitable, deeply entrenched political brand that they had spent years cultivating. Given the clear, undeniable choice between demanding ethical accountability for the people and protecting the optics of their own political coalition, they chose the optics every single time. They chose the power of the chamber and the preservation of a political legacy over the brutal, devastating reality of 17,000 ruined lives. They looked at the destroyed pensions, the lost health care, and the repossessed homes of 17,000 American citizens who had done nothing but work hard, and they collectively decided to look the other way to protect one of their own. The American public did not just watch a standard political debate today. They watched an illusion absolutely and permanently shatter into a million unrecoverable pieces. They did not just watch 2 opposing ideologies trade rehearsed talking points across the center aisle of the Capitol. Instead, they watched a measured, hyper-prepared, and fundamentally serious leader use nothing but public records, sworn financial disclosures, and cold, hard, unfeeling facts to methodically dismantle a carefully constructed political shield that had taken 6 years to build. Speaker Mike Johnson did not need to raise his voice or hurl personal insults. He did not play to the lowest common denominator of partisan anger or use theatrical gestures. He simply read the math out loud on a federal microphone and allowed the devastating, undeniable weight of the truth to crush the performative theater that had dominated the room for 43 minutes. In that defining hour, the country saw exactly what hides behind the curtain of modern political rhetoric. They saw that beneath the loud, passionate speeches about corporate greed and the necessity of intervention, beneath the endless practice claims of systemic victimization, and beneath the constant, exhausting churn of performative outrage, there is a distinctly different and much darker reality. There are real numbers that do not align with the speeches. There are real bank accounts and offshore trusts that tell a story of personal enrichment. There are real, devastating, life-altering consequences for everyday, hardworking citizens who just want to wake up, put on their uniforms, go to a steady job, and provide a decent life for their families. These people were not the beneficiaries of the political fight. They were the casualties. The working class was used as a convenient rhetorical prop, a mere stepping stone for someone else's rapid accumulation of power and wealth, only to be discarded the moment the financial timing required it. The people who claimed to fight for the marginalized were the very ones whose actions led to 17,000 people standing in unemployment lines. In the silence that followed the hearing, the truth remained on the podium in the form of a 400-page report. It was a record of what happens when the pursuit of a brand becomes more important than the people that brand was supposed to serve. The country watched as the facade of the champion of the people dissolved under the weight of $38 million in unexplainable financial movement. They saw the tears of a representative who had no answers when the administrative errors were finally read out loud. Today was the day the receipts were finally shown to the world, and the bill was paid by the 17,000 workers whose lives were changed forever. The illusion is gone, the record is public, and the names of those workers will no longer be ignored by a country that is finally paying attention to the math behind the mask. The 400-page heavy black binder is still sitting exactly where he left it on the mahogany podium. The thick, heavily documented pages are still laying wide open under the bright, high-definition television lights. The timeline of the collapsed merger and the offshore transfers is now completely, irrevocably public. The receipts have been permanently printed into the official congressional record. The sworn financial disclosures, the routing numbers, the dates, and the unexplainable administrative errors are now readily available for anyone in this entire country who is finally willing to read them. The truth is no longer hidden in the dark corners of bureaucratic oversight committees. It is resting squarely on the center stage of American politics. If you fundamentally believe that the absolute truth is always found buried in the financial receipts, and if you believe that real, tangible accountability must always matter infinitely more than carefully choreographed, taxpayer-funded political theater, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel right now. We are fiercely, unapologetically committed to digging through the documents and exposing the real, unvarnished records they desperately try to hide behind convenient administrative errors and endless, exhausting PR spin. Go down to the comment section right now, this very second, and type the exact number 17,000 to show your absolute, unwavering support for the hardworking American men and women who were callously sacrificed in this dark financial. Do not let this story fade into the background of the 24-hour news cycle. Share this video directly with the airline worker in your life who lost their pension. Share it with the small business owner in your town who understands what it means to sign the front of a paycheck. Share it with everyone you know who desperately needs to see exactly what happens when the undeniable mathematical facts finally catch up to the empty, performative rhetoric of the Washington establishment. The public record is completely open. The truth is finally out in the broad daylight. The financial receipts are crystal clear. And for the first time in a very long time, the country is finally truly paying attention.